You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Donovan Woods with the Fuels Institute and NACS, and I'm here with my special guest.
Hey, this is Stephanie Sikorski with NACS.
You know, Stephanie, when people usually think about UPS, they think about the well-branded brown trucks that come into their neighborhood and deliver their favorite packages from their favorite places. But, you know, there's a lot more to UPS than what you may think. So we have a special guest with us here today from UPS. He's going to tell us all about the different things that we would never think of when it comes to UPS. And our guest is Tom Madrecki from UPS, and he is the Director of Urban Innovation and Mobility at UPS. What does that mean, Tom?
I'm only laughing because it's honestly like a question I get all the time, including from like our company. So basically my role is to foster collaborative partnerships between UPS and cities around the world, primarily in the US, just in the course of like my day-to-day work. And really to also foster a culture of innovation, and then to deploy pilot projects, innovative technologies, new ways of doing business, to sort of create win-win situations, both in terms of like actual execution and implementation, and then also on the policy or like rulemaking side, as cities look to address quality of life issues, congestion, sustainability, air quality, that sort of thing.
So all important things is what we're saying.
All the important things. We're just gonna like hit all the top line, talking points that all the cities want to talk about.
So my dad actually was a 20-year vet of UPS. He was the parcel guy coming around your neighborhoods, running around 24 hours a day, it seemed like. I don't think of UPS when it comes to innovation, but what is it that UPS is trying to do or looking to work with in terms of with cities? What would you be looking for?
Right. So I think what's really interesting is that, right, like on the surface, UPS is this like 100-plus-year-old trucking company. Right. And at the same time, the reason that UPS has been successful for so long is that it's really also an engineering company, and it's a technology company. And so even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, UPS is pushing the bounds of what's possible. And it's just a continued, I think, evolution of how do you drive efficiency and from our business standpoint, how do you drive like a profit margin that you want to see, but then also how do you, I think, deliver the services that customers want, and especially in an age of e-commerce where I think that it's really sort of like a culture of whatever you want, when you want it, wherever you want it.
And before you know it.
And yeah, before you know it, perhaps, maybe like Alexa's reading your mind. You have to be able to, I think, meet higher and higher levels of service, and it puts certain constraints on our business as well, because historically UPS has been a B2B company, and over the course of 10, 15 years, it's really become primarily a B2C company. Yeah. And that creates certain cost pressures. It reduces what we would call sort of the pieces per stop, because you're delivering smaller numbers of packages to greater numbers of stops. Primarily also in residential neighborhoods or like dense downtown, like apartment building situations, things like that. And you're no longer just like pulling up to the loading dock, unloading a bunch of stuff and going on your way. And in that sort of environment, it's a bit challenging and constantly evolving, and I think evolving faster than ever before. We're looking to consider what is really the most efficient way of doing business, and how, as the same time as cities look to address certain issues, let's say around congestion, if they're looking to potentially restrict some double parking situations or change like how the curb functions, if they're looking to maybe minimize the use of heavier trucks in certain downtown areas, things like that, then we also have to adapt in that environment. And so I think the most visible example of some of the work that I do is allowing electronic tricycle delivery. For better or worse, I've sort of...
Wait, what is that? Electronic?
Yeah, I'm sorry, tricycle delivery?
Yes. So like for better or worse, I've become the bike guy at UPS, which is partially like a good thing because I'm a cyclist myself and I love it. But basically what it is, it's a model, whereas, like the traditional UPS model is we have a distribution center outside of the city.
Right.
There's a bunch of trucks. They get loaded in the morning.
Right.
They go out and they make their rounds and they come back to the center. Another hypothetical way of doing business that in certain neighborhood topologies, depending on how dense it is, depending on the sidewalk infrastructure, bike lanes, like different regulatory restrictions, things like that. You could imagine having sort of like a mini staging area or package depot that's been, and this is sort of where my government affairs type role, but it's approved by the city that, it's a use of public space or private space that's maybe not normally allowed. But you have this staging area, and then you're able to bring those packages that would be normally on a truck to that staging area. And then from just like throughout the day, you can, work from that place to the different destinations and deliver by this zero emissions, human scaled cycle logistics concept. And so we rolled out the first of those projects in Hamburg, Germany a few years ago. And we actually now have 30 projects all around the world. A lot of them in Europe because of Europe is obviously much older, a lot of medieval streets and just different street design. But we also have a project in Pittsburgh. We have a project in Fort Lauderdale. We're working on one in Seattle, and hopefully a few others in different cities soon to come.
So one thing you mentioned, we talked about 100 years and how does, nowadays with us evolving faster and faster, how do you stick around for 100 years? And then what's that next 100 years will say look like? And certainly from Fuels Institute and also what we do at NACS, we talk about not just looking down the road, but around the corner. It sounds like that's something that you all adopt as well.
Yeah. So I'll sort of like break it into two pieces. One of the things that I think is like sort of interesting about the whole like 100-year arc of UPS actually started as a bike delivery company. And so for like me to be working on these issues today, I think says something about the resurgence of cities, especially because UPS, when it started, was primarily designed around like urban shopping type situations, right? That you would go to the store, maybe on your streetcar or something like that, and not be able to carry home your bags or the furniture item that you picked out or something. And that type of model actually is very proximally close in a way to e-commerce. It's just it flexed in a different way. So some of the same challenges that we've dealt with in the past are also the things that we're going to deal with in the future. And how we, I think, deal with those challenges, I think, is a combination of just like there's sort of a historic cultural aspect of UPS, like constructive dissatisfaction, of like expressing that like the need to like constantly improve. So I think that it's partially baked into the culture of UPS to deal with it, and like how we've managed and grown our company. But it really does, I think, get to the sort of like engineering mindset where we're the company that has built in a process for like how you should put your seatbelt on, because if every driver saved 5 seconds putting their seatbelt on every time they started the car, you could save you start doing these like crazy algorithmic calculations. And we put a really big emphasis on the numbers side of things. In terms of like adapting for the future and like predicting the future, I think that one of the things that's sort of top of mind, especially in my role, is the rapid growth of urbanization. So if you look out into the future and you say, okay, by 2050, nearly 70% of the world's population will live in cities. UPS also predicts that in the future, 70% of our deliveries will be made in urban areas. And sort of as I alluded to earlier, urban areas are often sometimes our most challenging. And so if you're going from, especially in the US, I think, from a pretty car-centric sprawl type delivery situation to one where really it comes down to a distribution network and then figuring out a way to do that last mile or last 50 feet as efficiently as possible and navigating the lack of curbside, the different restrictions that you might get put in place, parking tickets, like all the things that are going to impact your profit margins. We'd like to sort of stay ahead of that and find ways of doing that the most efficient and I think constructive way possible too, because we want to be good partners with cities.
Now, when you're talking about laying the foundation for the future and that roadmap and predicting where we'll go, we're not talking like 3 or 5 years. How far out do you guys typically look when you're planning for what's around the corner?
I think that so in my role, I think I have the luxury of looking further out. I think that from an operation, like if you, depending on who you ask, right, at UPS, like there are a lot of people right now that are their entire job is focused on how do you deal with the surge of packages at peak season. UPS volume essentially doubles at peak, and so it's the thing, and it's like what you either win or lose on the street about. It's the thing that everybody focuses on, and sort of like, oh well, did you hit your peak now? So like there's a lot of people that think that far out in terms of like a couple of months, and then there's also just like the day-to-day operators that are really concerned about like there's a bunch of packages and they need to get from point A to point B. And so that isn't to say that they're not thinking about those things, but I think I'm sort of in a unique role that I get to think a little bit further out than I don't have a bunch of packages right now waiting for me to be delivered. But they do have to get, they have to get to their destination. So
how does UPS define what urban is? Because we live in the DC, right? Our studio here is in the DC metro area. I live in Fairfax, which is roughly 20 miles from Washington, D.C., which in theory, that's the urban area, and I live in the suburbs. Would you consider Fairfax, or let me go back. What is your definition of urban?
I don't know if there like specifically is, like there's no like UPS branded, like this is above certain package density X, it's this. I think that when I sort of think about the urban environment, I start to think about the presence of vertical density and then the degree to which it's oriented around maybe it's transit, maybe it's different transportation modes, and sort of that there's a difference in sort of like how people generally get around and like how the built environment functions and like what it's designed to do. Like, is it designed to allow you to drive everywhere, or is it really designed so that you can cross the street? And I guess you can drive to it, but your primary thing therefore is just sort of just like park or go to a garage or something like that. And that's sort of how I break it out. And then even within urban environments, I think we see radically different neighborhood topologies. So if I'm thinking about how do you innovate in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that's very different than if I'm looking to do some innovation in parts of LA or Santa Monica. Right. And so I think about the sort of the density question, not just in terms of address density, which is a really important thing for UPS in terms, and some of the innovation work that I do in terms of like how proximally close are certain addresses? Like, would it be faster to deliver by, let's say, tricycle, or how many miles traveled will a vehicle actually have to go? But then in a different situation, if there's a bunch of vertical density, that creates other challenges, right? If a driver is delivering in a large apartment building or a really large office building, he might actually just be parking right outside and spending his entire day in like two buildings. We have a driver in DC that I know really well. He literally parks at a Whole Foods loading dock, and he does his entire route from that loading dock. He just like walks through apartment buildings. He knows like the different like little avenues through, and he just comes back to his car, walks, and he saves time rather than driving around. So,
you mentioned that UPS in the past was B2B, and that makes so much sense. I think back to when my dad worked when I was a teenager. I rarely ever saw a UPS truck on my actual street where I lived. Always, when I started working, I saw them and I used them to mail things when we actually mailed things on a regular basis, 20 years ago. And yesterday. Let's be honest. But B2C makes a lot of sense to me because I won't name the company, but there's a certain company that I'd say once a week, I order something. And on my street, our UPS guy comes every single day. And that has changed. So I'm assuming what your definition of urban has to be very fluid, because somewhere like a suburban area could have the same feel as a downtown true metropolitan area, correct?
Right. And I mean, and I think that what I was trying to get at in sort of like the built environment factors that play into that is that you, if you're familiar with like the DC area or something like that, there's an area out in the suburbs called the Mosaic District.
Right.
That's like, it feels very urban in the sense that, but it's also like at the same time you leave the Mosaic District and right across the street is a Home Depot, and the other side is an H Mart. Like there's like all of these very suburban things present there. And I think that what you start looking at is you sort of look at probably let's say it could be like a 6 block by 6 block area or something like that, right? Where you're seeing different types of neighborhoods, even within the same geography, like overall. And I think you can start to, and one of the things that I'm really excited about or think about a lot in sort of like a very nerdy way, is like rather than optimizing just based in sort of like a geospatial way, like around miles traveled, could you actually optimize not just by miles traveled, but also by density, by sort of like adding extra layers or like extra dimensions to that? So it's like, okay, in this particular retail corridor, it would actually be more efficient to deliver by this type of vehicle. And in this street, it would be more efficient to deliver by an electric truck. On this street, it would be, really just need a giant thing. And maybe over here, actually, we use I'm not being funny, but we use a boat. Like, I don't know. And rather than just saying, okay, we're UPS, we dispatch the same car and it goes out from a center. Like it's it's one model, but it doesn't have to be the entirety of it.
So I want to take us on a little different route for a moment. I had an opportunity to listen to one of the TED Talks that you delivered, which was fantastic. And you talked about, as we're thinking about planning for the future, it's not really about the land, it's really about a home. And that was interesting to me, especially as you talked about happiness and health. And one of the quotes that you said was, happiness and health aren't engineering problems, they're people problems. Not a novel concept, but why do you think something like that is so difficult for us to get our heads around?
I think some of it, and especially on a planning side, or like how do you get citizens to be involved? It comes down to there isn't a lot of good ways for everyday citizens to engage with government decisions or like land use decisions or things like that. So it's either if you're like an everyday person, you probably go to work. Maybe you have kids, like you're running from point A to point B. You're concerned about something other than what is the 2020 plan or something that's going to sit on a shelf at some planning office. And you're not going to go to the public library, like open zoning session held at like 1 to 3 p.m. during work hours. And so like there isn't that regular ability to engage in these decisions that over a long period of time actually are impactful. And I think that the other issue there too is that because it's such a far into the future thing, people see change as this like slow incremental thing, and you sort of like get to that point eventually and you're like, man, things have changed so much since I was young, and be like, you were there the entire time, like you actually did see it change. It wasn't just like you woke up 30 years in the future and like,
I think you're
wow, the demographics have changed.
Yeah.
Everything has changed in this neighborhood. It's dense and like multiracial. Like that has not actually
been hidden from everyone.
Hidden like thing. It's ongoing and it's constantly happening.
Right now, Donovan. Right now.
Keep my eyes open.
But it is, I think, hard to sort of wrap your head around that slow incremental progress that happens.
And so with that, you talked about the power to improve really comes from engagement. And certainly our convenience retailers, our suppliers, heavily engaged in the communities. So what would you say to groups like them or others, especially you talked about from collaboration, and it's really about connecting the dots and bringing everyone together. How do we work more collaboratively together?
I think some of it, honestly, is like a communications issue, or like how do you not just like brand yourself to be like a community gathering place or a place where it's like an inclusive place, or it's a place that people can go to on a regular basis that's convenient, but that it's sort of thinking about like what are the needs of the local community, what do people actually do in each place, thinking about maybe it's not just the same model in every single neighborhood, right? That like the services or the needs of certain residents in one area are different than the needs in another area, and maybe they're respectively going to the same store, like the same branded, convenience store or something like that in different neighborhoods, but what they're actually getting, the value that they're getting from that experience is different. And so then being able to really think about those particular needs, to market to those needs, to sort of like openly engage and use that communications stream as an opportunity to like listen and just like think about like, what do you want to see here? Are we meeting your needs as a store, a place to hang out outside, inside, wherever it is? And what can we do better? I think is.
So basically talk to the public.
Yeah.
Ask them what they think before we act.
Probably. I mean, I think that's a rare thing, right?
Very.
That like and especially in like a business environment, like you're always there sort of thinking like, well, what can I do myself to like sort of, I think, impact or influence others? And you're not thinking, I want to learn from others what they care about. And that's like it's a subtle shift, but I think that we oftentimes like you try like 6 different ad campaigns, or you try a bunch of different things, and you just like throw them out there and you're like, well, none of them worked. And you're like, well, what if you just asked them what would work and then went from there? Like maybe that's a more engaging approach. Right.
More personal, more authentic.
Mm-hmm.
So my last question for you, from me at least, we are, this podcast is called Convenience Matters. We are NACS. We are Fuels Institute. We talk about what people need, what's actually happening. So would you say UPS is focused on continuing to be a convenient resource for businesses to reach their customers, or who really would you say is your customer?
I think historically, the way that UPS saw itself, especially in like a B2B environment, was that our customer was the shipper. And I think today it's probably pretty common knowledge that like it's 50% of both, right? And like while J. Crew might have been our customer as like sending you a sweater or something, right, you are going to be the one that picks up the phone and complains to UPS because you didn't get the sweater.
Right.
And so we're trying to provide solutions, I think, on both ends. And I think where I'll sort of like tie this into some like the convenience store aspect is in terms of how do you make, like e-commerce should be one of the things that's the most convenient, like development sort of like in the past 10 years, like when I need something, I can get it. But there's built into everybody's day, there's various complications. You weren't home when the UPS guy came and he asked you to sign for your box of wine or something like that.
I'd be angry.
And so like we've worked with like the deployment of, let's say we call like access lockers, where you can, maybe it's installed on a convenience store or like outside or on the facade or something like that, where you can make a drop off or a delivery and then pick it up while you're going to your other store destination.
I had a friend that just mentioned something like that, and I refer to them all. I've defaulted to all of them as being Amazon lockers. So UPS actually has their own branded version of that same idea.
Correct. And so, and then even like within the realm of lockers, there's like subsets, right? Of like, so like one of the ideas that I'm really excited about is the potential for universal lockers, like a type of locker that was maybe more city backed or owned, that could then be utilized by many different carriers rather than just sort of individual things. UPS has had sort of in the development of the idea of like a locker concept, I think that we've really sort of tried to push the bounds of what's possible in terms of their deployment and the sort of the scale at which they're deployed. And I think the next sort of step or the iteration of that is how do you make them really useful? And so I think maybe even goes back to your question about like how do you become like a better convenient store, right? Or like how do you, so a bunch of lockers just out in the world might work. Some of them might work better than others. And so I think that on our part, it's really drilling down on like, well, which ones are utilized? Where do you locate them successfully? How do you make them part of everybody's life in the most like functional way? Because some of them, I think in practice are more utilized than others. So.
Yeah. So I guess I wonder, we need to have you back, because I have so many other questions to talk to you about, and I think our audience has a lot of questions to talk to you about. But thank you for being here, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.